Oh, okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming today for our second CAPPI Chat. And today we have a really interesting conversation to be had on marijuana legalization, pros and cons, questions and answers. Today our speakers are Dr. Peter Hendricks and Dr. Hendricks and Sun, both from School of Public Health. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter to start CAPPI Chat.
All right, so I'll just dive right in. And let me just say from the beginning, I've got an 11-year-old here with me. We'll see if he allows me to make this presentation without interrupting, but if you hear a small voice in the background, you know what's going on. So this is a hot topic, obviously, and Alabama is one of only now really a handful of states that don't have a comprehensive medical cannabis law. So we're one of the few states in which cannabis is, you might say, completely illegal for any reason. So the first thing I want to say is when we talk about legalization, it's important to say that there are so many ways that we could liberalize our marijuana policy. And often people tend to think in sort of dichotomous ways. That is that it's either completely illegal and criminal and we're going to be incarcerating people for possession in small amounts, or it's going to be available on every street corner. And these are extremes, of course. There are many ways that we could change our policy. So for instance, we could allow use but forbid production and sale. We could allow use and the sale of small quantities, but forbid production and wholesale distribution. This is essentially what's going on in the Netherlands, and so on. I mean, there are almost unlimited ways of doing this. And if we're going to talk about legalization, we have to then acknowledge that the world does not exist in this sort of dichotomy that's often presented in political spheres. So repealing our current law is simple in concept, but figuring out exactly how we might replace them is much more complex, as you might imagine, because there are so many different ways of changing our policy. But it's important to know that at least half of all Americans support legalization, even for recreational purposes. So, first, what is marijuana? This is an American term for cannabis sativa. This is a plant, the flowers of which contain concentrated cannabinoids. The leaves have lesser quantities. The hashish or resin is made by extracting cannabinoid-rich trichomes, which I've tried to zoom in on here on the right. You can see these trichomes that are really rich in the cannabinoids. How does it feel to get high? I know many people probably know the answer to this only based on the epidemiological data we have. Many people have used cannabis. Many Americans have used cannabis at least once in their lifetime. But I'll go ahead and discuss this briefly. Most psychoactive drugs influence one or more of three nerve receptors here: dopamine, serotonin, or GABA. And chemicals in marijuana react with a pair of receptor systems that are unique, known as CB1 and CB2, that are unique to cannabinoids and to a naturally occurring neurotransmitter known as anandamide. I'm surprised I pronounced that correctly, maybe. So what are the effects? Relaxation, mild euphoria. Some people report a focusing of attention and sensory experience. In some cases, there's an impairment of short-term memory and executive functioning. Some people report an enhancing of the appetite and receptivity to humor. At higher doses, certainly people can experience anxiety and panic. And here we have some noted celebrities who are marijuana enthusiasts. I think we all recognize Willie Nelson there on the right, Snoop Dogg and Seth Rogen with Wiz Khalifa on the left. So there are more than 60 cannabinoids in marijuana, and tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is just one of these more than 60 cannabinoids. Now, we understand that THC is responsible for the reinforcing effects, we think primarily, but we don't really know what those other cannabinoids might do. It's not well understood. Now, there is one compound that's drawing increasing attention. Many have probably heard of this, and that's cannabidiol. It's not intoxicating as far as we know, but it may be anxiolytic. That is, it might reduce anxiety and might even have antipsychotic properties. And there are a lot of claims made about what CBD might do. Many of these have not really been tested rigorously through empirical science, but we are interested in this. One thing we do know is it seems that marijuana with a better balance between CBD and THC may be less risky. In other words, if there's more CBD, it appears to be less addicting. It appears to have fewer of those unwanted side effects like anxiety and panic and disruption of memory if there's more CBD. So, what are the risks? And here's something I want to emphasize. The hard truth is that we haven't reached a consensus. The scientific community can't really say. We know that 30 million Americans report using in the past year, and 22 million Americans report using in the past month. That makes it one of the most commonly used drugs in the country. Now, of those who have reported using in the past month, 1 in 8 met criteria for dependence at some point in the previous year. Okay, so about 2.75 million people will meet criteria for dependence. And about 9% of those who use marijuana end up being dependent. So, how do we compare that with, let's say, alcohol and cocaine? About 15% and 16% of those who use alcohol and cocaine respectively end up being dependent. So, for some people who might argue that it's impossible to become addicted or dependent to marijuana, that's not correct. But it might be that it's less addicting than some other substances like alcohol and cocaine. Another thing to consider is, some drugs create more severe dependence than others. They disrupt your functioning more than others. And from what we can tell, marijuana dependence does not, on average, create the same social and personal problems as alcohol, cocaine, or heroin dependence. The Institute of Medicine has characterized the degree of dependence as weak, which means that one could be dependent on cannabis and conceivably still function fairly well, in the same way that people who smoke cigarettes have jobs and relationships and take care of their responsibilities. So the type of dependence that is produced by cannabis appears to be weak. And yet still, there are 350,000 drug treatment admissions per year, mostly adolescents and young adults. More than 50% of these admissions are referred by the criminal justice system. Now, a safety ratio is the ratio of the average fatal dose to the average recreational dose. And generally, we want to see bigger safety ratios because that means there's more safety. The ratios for alcohol, heroin, methamphetamine, and cocaine range from 6 to 15. There's no known fatal dose of marijuana, but it has been estimated that such a dose must be at least 1,000 times the amount typically consumed. So I think it's fair to say that, we don't know that it's possible to overdose fatally on marijuana. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing my slides here. Okay. Now, that said, the CDC's Wonder database reports 26 deaths between 1999 and 2007 that were attributed to cannabis dependence. That's roughly 3 deaths per year. Now, what that means, we're not entirely sure. We're not. I would assume that these are not fatal overdose deaths, but they could be. Certainly, people with an underlying heart issue could have a heart attack on smoking marijuana, and there could be sort of a chronic issue caused by regular cannabis use. So about 3 deaths per year. So the risk of cannabis use is roughly, with regard to death, the same as taking a single commercial airline flight in the US. So the risk is low. 3 deaths per year compare with tobacco, where we have almost 500,000 Americans who die every year from tobacco, or alcohol, where we have almost 100,000 deaths every year. So the risk seems to be pretty darn low. The Drug Abuse Warning Network records more mentions of marijuana, about 375,000 per year, than any other illegal drug except for cocaine. Now, these would be people who present to emergency departments for a drug-related cause. And if a drug like marijuana is thought to be involved in this emergency department admission, then it earns what is called a mention. And the belief is that most of these mentions stem from interactions or piggyback on other substances. So somebody might in fact be presenting to the emergency department for alcohol use or for major stimulant use or an opioid. And yet it is also mentioned that they've used cannabis as well. In other words, cannabis or marijuana is not the primary reason for their admission. The vast majority of people who are admitted for cannabis specifically are treated and released without being admitted. So in most cases, people have these anxiety or panic reactions and present to the emergency department because they're having a difficult time. We also know that marijuana will increase the likelihood of cough, phlegm, and wheeze, but there's no consistent association with pulmonary function. You know, a study published in JAMA by a team both at UAB and at UCSF, in fact, found that moderate users had better lung functioning than non-users, although heavy users had the worst lung functioning of these three categories that were evaluated. One benefit of legalization might be an increased use of vaporizers or other products that could decrease the risk of inhaling combusted marijuana smoke. And when we think about, you know, the risks of inhaling smoke, like we know that that's bad. That's you know, pretty logical. People would have known this hundreds of years ago. Inhaling smoke isn't good for your lungs. So inhaling combusted marijuana smoke, not good for your lungs, but you know, we should be careful not to necessarily equate this with tobacco use. And here's why. Marijuana users, though they typically inhale more deeply than tobacco smokers, they consume far less marijuana than tobacco smokers consume. Okay, so 20 grams of tobacco per day is typical, but if someone smoked 4 grams of marijuana per day, they would be an extremely heavy user. So even the most heavy users of marijuana consume only a fifth of the regular tobacco user. And there are mixed and weak results linking marijuana use to respiratory cancers. And you know, one thought is that some cannabinoids may inhibit the growth of tumors. So we have some notable marijuana users. At least one on the left is Spicoli there, played by Sean Penn from Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and then Shaggy from Scooby-Doo on the right. I don't think Shaggy was ever mentioned anything about marijuana in Scooby-Doo, but many people sort of jokingly refer to him as someone who may have been a user. So, you know, there are some psychological risks potentially. There's some evidence pointing to probable but a weak causal link between marijuana use and psychotic disorders. So if you have a personal or family history of psychosis, marijuana might be problematic and could hasten a psychotic break. Now, a lot of people wonder about this notion of amotivational syndrome. Like, if I use marijuana, won't I, like Spicoli here or Shaggy, be sort of unmotivated to do much with my life? Won't my academic performance suffering? Won't I be less interested in going to work? There is a correlation between marijuana use and poor academic and occupational performance, but as far as we know, this captures the effects of third variables. So it's not the marijuana that's doing this, but something about the type of person who, you know, uses marijuana in excess that might also make them more vulnerable to not performing especially well at school or work. So in the same way that excessive television watching might not directly cause poor academic or occupational performance, but some other underlying trait that drives one to watch TV all the time. There's no direct link between marijuana and these outcomes. What about the non-medical benefits of using marijuana? Well, much is claimed, little is known. That's Michael Phelps on the left. And that is, boy, I'm blanking right now, former running back of the New Orleans Saints.
Ricky Williams.
Yeah, Ricky Williams, thank you, Burl. Ricky Williams, who's become a cannabis entrepreneur himself. You know, users report that getting high is relaxing and pleasurable, and it contributes to other pleasures like food, music, dancing, art, conversation, humor, and sex. Maybe it helps with creativity. Perhaps there are boosts in athletic performance. You know, we just don't know. There are a lot of claims that have been made, and we haven't studied them enough to say for certain. What about the medical benefits? Okay, so the American public overwhelmingly supports making marijuana legal for medical purposes. About 8 in 10, that may have changed to 9 in 10. The support is increasing. The Institute of Medicine found that the therapeutic value is, quote, that there is therapeutic value, particularly for symptoms such as pain relief, control of nausea, vomiting, and appetite stimulation. But these effects are considered to be generally modest. And the IOM also views smoked marijuana as a crude THC delivery system and doesn't recommend long-term use, obviously because inhaling smoke isn't good for your lungs. what are the pros and cons of legalization? Well, I think it's important to point out, the costs of prohibition include a loss of liberty. And Americans in particular, we like our liberty. We want the freedom to do things that we'd like to do. We also, when there is prohibition, create a criminal enterprise and the need for reinforcement. So if we were to legalize marijuana, this would be a gain for those who want to use the drug and can do so without losing control. They gain the liberty of doing as they choose, and they get access to cheaper and safer products. They don't have to interact with any criminal enterprise. But if we do legalize marijuana, we're likely to increase the number of people who wind up abusing or becoming dependent. So when we legalize a drug, we have to choose between the problems associated with this increased level of excessive consumption over the problems associated with illicit dealing and enforcement. And are there shades of legalization? I would say absolutely. In a market society, most things are freely bought, sold, and used. But freely should not be taken literally. There are, of course, still rules designed to prevent fraud, damage to third parties, harm to children. Drugs are not the only prohibited goods. We have endangered species, weapons, child pornography, prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, human organs, etc. There are many things that fit in this category. If we legalize marijuana, of course, it would be subject to special rules. Those regulations don't enforce themselves, however, so that's something to consider. If we were to remove criminal penalties for possessing amounts for personal use, we would call this generally decriminalization. Right? Sometimes people confuse this term with legalization. Right? If we decriminalize marijuana, that would mean we're not going to arrest or incarcerate or charge with a criminal offense those who possess for personal use. It doesn't mean we're opening dispensaries on every corner. It doesn't mean we're now allowing for commercialization of the drug. It just means exactly what I said. We won't treat it like a criminal offense. Rion, tell me when it's time for you to jump in. I don't know what slide I'm at right now.
Yeah,
I think
maybe
I've got two more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah?
Maybe one more slide. Yeah.
Okay. So the question is then, why have drug laws in the first place? Well, we want to protect users from the risks of drug taking, or to protect other people from the risks some drug users might create. And generally, these policies are intended to reduce the unwanted consequences of drug use. But these can create unwanted consequences of illicit markets and the need to enforce these laws. Prohibition generally makes drugs more expensive and less convenient to buy, largely eliminates marketing efforts, but it also prevents the drug industry from lobbying for policies that promote addiction. So the extent of harm caused by a drug is a crucial variable in determining how much benefit is created by prohibition. And I think this makes the case for marijuana prohibition weaker than the case for any of the other major illegal drugs, right? Because we have to weigh the pros and cons. I'll do one more slide, then hand this over to Rion. So why would someone even consider legalizing a substance that causes harm? Well, first, the liberty to make our own decisions about our own lives is valuable. So that's something I think we all recognize as Americans. There are a lot of things that we do that carry with them harm, including driving a car, including physical activity, including skydiving, riding a bike, riding a horse, and so on, and so on, and so on. Intoxicating drugs are hardly the only potentially dangerous consumer items or activities. I haven't even mentioned guns, but that's another example. It's not obvious that the majority of users who do not abuse marijuana deserve to be inconvenienced to protect against the consequences of less responsible users. And illicit markets are much less consumer friendly. Enforcing drug laws is an ugly business. So it is possible that right now the laws are doing more damage to users than marijuana use itself does. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Rion. Do you need me to advance the slides, Rion, or can you?
I probably will just share my own screen.
Okay, let me stop sharing then and let you do that yourself.
And I might need the host's permission to share my screen. I think I could be made like a co-host so I can share my screen.
We're always working on it.
What I'm looking at I don't actually see that option for myself. Peter, can you do that?
Let's see.
If you click on my name,
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, let me share my screen quickly. I think here is where we are. Yeah, so wouldn't the results of a policy that treated marijuana like alcohol be an improvement over the current mess? However, the definition of better probably depends on our perspectives, and it depends on judgments about the relative importance of different kinds of harm and benefit. So with every regulation, some people will gain and others might get hurt. And we can observe what marijuana use looks like when it's prohibited, but we can only conjecture what it would look like if it were illegal, and there are still debates about what would happen if we legalize marijuana. And results surrounding two other abusable drugs already offered for sale are not very encouraging. For example, tobacco kills nearly 500,000 Americans every year, and it is also pretty bad globally. And alcohol kills around 100,000 every year. Alcohol is also responsible for a third to a half of all violent crimes and motor vehicle deaths. So these are not very promising results. But wasn't alcohol prohibition in the US a complete failure? So the prohibition regime collapsed as the enforcement machinery failed to keep up with the growth in the illicit market. However, deaths from causes fell by about a third as prices approximately tripled, and there were reductions in alcohol-related homicide. So in a sense that prohibition or like regulations needs to have proper enforcement alongside with it. And how much of the increase in consumption after legalization will really reflect increased heavy use rather than increased casual use? So as of right now, more than weekly users account for 90% of the marijuana demand. If we were to create a legal industry, the resulting business will have a strong profit incentive to create and sustain frequent and abusive consumption patterns. So in a sense, consumers' consumption patterns are likely to change once we legalize marijuana. And those who claim regulation and taxation could provide the benefits of prohibition without its costs might be asked why that doesn't seem to have happened with alcohol. So there are still a lot of unknowns if we were to legalize marijuana. And so what about legal availability without free trade? Couldn't that work? So I think a big problem with that is like here in the US, we just really like free trade, right? We like to have free markets. So first of all, I think it will be a kind of political issue to have a government controlled market. So there could be like a government monopoly behind the trade of marijuana, with the officials in charge being tasked with making drugs available, but not promoting their use. However, this will be very challenging, and there is no guarantee the political process would settle on a scheme as well crafted as the ones drawn by academics who can ignore political realities. Especially as of right now, we decided that marijuana trade is pretty much a state business. So imagine that 50 states will kind of need to coordinate at some level, will be pretty challenging for the political process. So why not just try it out now and then go back to the current system if legalization doesn't work? So this would probably be a good idea in theory, but the process is likely irreversible. So for example, think about our healthcare system. So a lot of other countries have government-owned hospitals, but since early on in America, we decided to have private hospitals. It's impossible for us to go back to a system where we have government-owned hospitals. So similarly, this would be probably an irreversible process with legalization of marijuana. So experimenting with that nationally may be impossible, and newly dependent users would not magically cease to be dependent. So for example, if you started offering them marijuana and decided to stop all of a sudden, they're unlikely to quit using marijuana. And then alcohol prohibition in the US reviewed the difficulty in trying to change the ingrained habits of millions of people. It is not clear that marijuana re-prohibition after a failed legalization experiment would do any better. So from these lessons in history, it is unlikely to work. So what do we know so far about marijuana legalization? So I will walk you through a brief history of marijuana use in the US. So marijuana did not achieve mass market status in the US until the mid-1960s. And we have archaeological evidence of hemp core dates back to almost 10,000 years ago. And the first recorded medical application of marijuana was actually in China around 2700 BC. And there were records of Indian religious use going back to 2000 BC. So actually Westerners were late adopters of marijuana at around early 19th century. In colonial America, marijuana was grown alongside tobacco for industrial use. In 1619, the Virginia Assembly passed legislation encouraging farmers to grow it. And by late 19th century, marijuana was a common ingredient in many medicines. So widespread use of marijuana as a recreational drug began in the early 1900s and were adopted by jazz musicians. And the government portrayals grossly exaggerated negative effects. So it was associated with African-American jazz culture and then hurt its image among the white majority. By 1931, 29 states had criminalized marijuana. In addition, marijuana was part of the 1950s beat culture, but use remained uncommon until the 1960s with the hippie culture. In 1967, lifetime prevalence among college students was 5%. However, 2 years later, it was 22%, and by 1971, it reached 51%. So it's really in the late 60s and early 70s that marijuana got really popular. And then the 1970 Nixon signed the Controlled Substance Act, the CSA, which categorized marijuana as a Schedule I drug. In the 1972 Sheffer Commission, it was stated, neither the marijuana user nor the drug itself can be said to constitute a danger to public safety. Therefore, the commission recommends possession of marijuana for personal use no longer be an offense, and casual distribution of small amounts of marijuana for no remuneration or insignificant remuneration no longer be an offense. So we can see, so this is a relatively positive attitude towards marijuana. However, Sheffer report drew an immediate and vehement denunciation from Nixon. Still, its publication reflected a shift in opinion among the public. Federal mandatory sentencing for possession was repealed, and by the end of the 1970s, 11 states had decriminalized possession and others reduced penalties. And marijuana prevalence increased throughout the 1970s, reaching a peak in 1979, where around 10% of high school seniors reported daily or nearly daily use. So not surprising, this fueled the parents' movement, which helped bring an end to the era of liberalization of marijuana use. So we all know what happened in the 80s. So the Reagan administration saw increasing levels of anti-marijuana rhetoric, and marijuana use dropped throughout the 1980s. And I am happy to show you this, I guess, 1 minute long video if people
Good
can.
clip.
Okay, let's play it.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects.
So of course we can see
That
here.
is not our video, by the way. But
Yeah, so the issue of marijuana legalization, of course, is very political. And marijuana use bounced back in the 80s, nearly doubling during the early and mid 1990s. And in 1996, California passed the Compassionate Use Act allowing medical use, and this has started a trend that we see today. So as of right now, 20 states have legalized access to medical marijuana, and 8 states and DC have legalized recreational use, increasing arrests related to stoned driving. So it is believed that this is the result of increased enforcement efforts. There is also increases in use among adults and in hospitalizations associated with marijuana use, including accidental ingestion by use. However, on the other hand, what we know is states with medical cannabis laws had a 24.8% lower mean annual opioid overdose mortality rate compared with states without medical cannabis laws. In addition, there are also decreases in alcohol-related automobile fatalities. So legalization of marijuana is associated with an almost 12% decrease in any BAC fatal crash per 100,000 licensed drivers, and 14% decrease in high BAC fatal crashes per 100,000 licensed drivers. And also marijuana helped with violent crimes. State medical marijuana laws may be correlated with a reduction in homicide and assault rates, net of other covariates. So what these are telling us is there are kind of spillover effect of marijuana legalization. It can't be considered just as a single matter. So of course it has other impact on people's health. For example, legalization of medical marijuana is associated with a 5% decrease in the total suicide rate, an 11% decrease in the suicide rate of 20 through 29-year-old males, and a 9% decrease in the suicide rate of 30 through 39-year-old males. There is a 12% drop in marijuana use among teenagers, and this is reported among 12 to 17-year-olds in Colorado. So Colorado also makes more on cannabis taxes than alcohol. So this is, of course, a very profitable business for states. In 2015, the legal marijuana industry in Colorado created more than 18,000 new full-time jobs and generated $2.4 billion in economic activity. So with all these in mind, I guess this is kind of like the theme of our discussion today. So what do people think? Shall we legalize marijuana?
All right, is this question time now? Question from the audience?
I think so, yes. So Q&A.
This is Karen Propsy. What kind of decrease have we seen in criminal justice admissions, or is there, I'm sorry, I might have missed that, but did you talk anything about arrests and such that go down?
Yeah, so if you can see my slide, so there is a decrease in violent crimes.
Oh, but I guess the question is, do we see fewer arrests for marijuana related, like possession?
Right, even in just medical marijuana states where it's not legalized for recreational use, or even in states like Alabama where maybe some public officials feel like there's maybe bigger fish to fry than picking up, personal use marijuana.
Yeah, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I mean, I think it goes without saying that, say, in Colorado, when they legalized marijuana, they had a sharp decrease in marijuana-related arrests, only because it was no longer codified in their law that this was a criminal offense. It would be really interesting to look at that. I know that Randall Woodfin has sort of advocated for a decreased emphasis on enforcing cannabis laws himself. I don't think that he would characterize that as decriminalization, but it's been sort of lower on his list of priorities. I would love to see what the data are, but I mean, there are clearly a reduction in arrests related to cannabis possession because it's no longer something that law enforcement pursues.
Let me ask a question. So I'm wondering, in those states that have legalized marijuana for medical uses, what sort of third-party reimbursement trends are there to sort of support like insurance and whatnot, you know, for this medicine? Do people still have to like come out of pocket for it, or is this something that they can have insurance coverage for? Is there any sort of data related to that? And I'm just asking, I'll leave that question, but I'm just asking because in my own home state of Illinois, currently legal for recreation and medical uses, but there's a trend kind of popping up that I can allude to here in a second. But I'm just wondering, like, what do you guys know about like sort of insurance coverage for things like medical marijuana?
Well, I don't know anything about that, Rihanna. I mean, my assumption is that people are paying out of pocket. I don't know of any insurance carriers that cover that, but I could be wrong.
I know in
mean,
Connecticut they didn't cover it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the interesting thing is where you have states that have legalized both medical and recreational cannabis, but it's still federally considered illegal. And the federal government has generally just not been enforcing that law for, you know, at least 10 years, more than 10 years. So I would imagine that for these insurance companies, there's it's a bit complicated to then allow some sort of coverage for something that may be legal in the state but not federally. And that's really makes things difficult for people with businesses because many of these banks are, you know, FDIC insured, and if it's an illegal activity on the federal level, then you can't necessarily store your revenue in a bank. And there are some stories of people, you know, storing cash in large warehouses. So the fact that you have legal, the drug is legal on the state level but not federally makes things complicated across a number of domains.
Okay, so that's consistent kind of with what I was thinking too. Mostly it's a cash enterprise. The phenomenon I'm aware of in Illinois that's sort of popping up is that the dispensaries sort of have a section of the store that's for medical use and a section of the store that's for recreational use. And if I recall correctly, I think like the section of the stores that's for like, or the dispensary that's like medical use, there may be some sort of state-based like rules in place to not like price gouge. It needs to be sort of cost controlled. But because of that, I don't think a lot of these stores do a good job of actually keeping the various types and strains that are for medical use. And thus they're like, well, we don't have that. Just go get it from the recreational side. But the recreational side is like wild, wild west insofar as they can kind of charge what they want. Mm-hmm. And what ends up happening then is that the medical users have to go to the recreational side, so to speak, but then they're maybe paying double, triple what they would have if they actually had the product on the medical side of the dispensary. Does that make sense?
I think it does. And my understanding too is that there might be some products in terms of potency that you cannot obtain if you're a recreational user, whereas you can if you have a medical card. But like you said, it's sort of it is sort of a wild, wild west in many ways, and there are probably a lot of trends that vary by state. I mean, and it's an evolving target too. I think they're regulating it as best they can, and sort of the way in which they do that changes from time to time. But I think what you described is more or less accurate.
So, Peter, I have a question as well. Another question. So, in the states that have legalized it for recreation or medical use, do you see an increase in people initiating it in terms of the rates?
Well, you know, one thing they found is that you do see lower rates of initiation among children and adolescents, and that is in large part because you haven't eliminated a black market, but it is substantially smaller. And the reason for that is, imagine your typical adult can either go to a dispensary and purchase the drug legally and have their choice of a wide range of, you know, high quality regulated products, or they can buy from you know, the guy down the street, a you know, connection, someone who's providing a product of, you know, unknown quality, though is likely purchased from a dispensary and with an increase in the price. So for adolescents now, there are fewer options to obtain the drug, and that's a good thing because, as you know, there are some concerns about the use of marijuana on the developing brain. So we do see a pretty nice sharp decrease in the use of cannabis among children and adolescents, which is normally when, as we know, substance use will be initiated. Whether or not we see an increase in initiation among adults is a great question. And I would love to do a literature search and see if there's any evidence that adults who might not have otherwise ever even tried are trying. I mean, I think it's common sense that we would see that you legalize the drug, more people are going to use it and more people are going to become dependent. Though there's also some evidence to suggest that some adults who otherwise would have used alcohol because it was legal, when given the option, choose instead to use cannabis, which is likely less problematic in a number of ways.
So at least from my understanding of what I've read of the Colorado experience, they had an initial uptick of increase in ER visits, an increase of medical encounters related to cannabinoid products or cannabis products, but that kind of leveled out over time for in-state people. But they've consistently seen a sharp rise in out-of-state people, and particularly in the ER.
Yeah, so I think a common experience and something that concerned them was people with little experience with edibles in particular would ingest without knowing what a large, moderate, or small dose might be, and might ingest an edible and not feel effects after 30, 45 minutes, or even an hour, and think that that meant they should take more. So they're unaware of the sort of lag time and feeling the effects of THC. So there are a number of people who then would have ingested far more THC than they wanted to and experienced panic and anxiety, and would then admit to the emergency department because they felt they were dying or having a heart attack. And there are some humorous news, there was some humorous news coverage where a correspondent would be sent out to Colorado, and that person had not used cannabis before, but was told they were to try an edible, and they'd eat half a cookie and say, I haven't felt a thing, so I'm going to go ahead and eat the remainder. And like many people in that situation, had a pretty uncomfortable experience. Ingesting more THC than maybe 5 to 10 milligrams, pretty darn unpleasant. So I think there has been a lot of that, but people learn fairly quickly. There are also reports of pets getting into THC products, and owners being concerned about their pets, and children also getting into cannabis candy, thinking they had just obtained regular candy, and parents bringing their children to emergency departments concerned about that. So, I mean, there certainly have been mishaps. Fortunately, as I mentioned, as far as we know, you can't fatally overdose on marijuana or THC. Not to say that it's not a concern, not to say that it's not very unpleasant for the people who've ingested these drugs at much higher doses than they intended, but mishap is probably the best characterization of it, because people aren't dying.
So I heard you guys mention the Wild Wild West, and I'm wondering what are some of the practical aspects that Alabama could take when embarking on legalization of marijuana to avoid the Wild Wild West.
Well, I'm going to let Rian maybe say. I'm sorry, Rian, I'm dominating, but I would say it's a smart idea to at least start with the recognition that criminalizing possession for personal use doesn't help anybody. I think almost every policy expert on the planet would tell you that criminalization of drug use is a big mistake. It's a huge waste of resources. We've thrown trillions of dollars away on the war on drugs, and treating drug users like criminals just doesn't help anything anywhere. I would say in many ways that's what makes the current situation something like the Wild Wild West, that we treat people who are using a drug as criminals and arrest and incarcerate them and ruin lives. That needs to stop. But I know your question was still more geared toward how do we prevent this sort of Wild Wild West that we see in Colorado. I don't know that I have a good answer for you, because we have no idea what things will look like until we until we initiate them. And I think the best thing to do is to, if we're going to make changes, make them very gradually, noting that it's really hard to go back. So you might make very, very gradual changes and see what happens before continuing down that path of continued liberalization. Rian, what do you think?
And I think another interesting question is like when you have other states who have legalized marijuana, right? Like neighboring states of Alabama, what does it mean if we don't legalize it? People could just, drive across the border and get it. So I think that's another interesting, I guess like definitely for like policy studies, people are always interested to look at state level variations. So yeah, maybe with more data in the future, we could look at that.
And I wouldn't say that things are bad in Colorado. These are sort of, when Colorado decided to legalize marijuana, many people look to Colorado now as sort of this petri dish, like, okay, let's see what happens here. And we're going to learn a lot. And many states have realized, okay, actually, this might be a good move. It generates revenue. It seems to decrease opioid overdose deaths. It seems to decrease motor vehicle accidents. It seems to decrease violent crime that would otherwise be associated with alcohol. There seems to be a substitution effect at play. Now, how exactly do we reimburse if managed care is involved, and how do we regulate these products? These are all difficult things to do, but they're moving targets and ongoing. So I think most states have decided that it's the cost benefit ratio is in support of legalization, and we're really one of, I think now 13 that don't have at least a medical cannabis law. So I think most states are moving forward. Now, before the COVID pandemic hit, our state was considering medical cannabis, legalizing medical cannabis, and that initiative sort of stalled when the pandemic hit. But I think it's likely that Alabama will also move forward in that regard. And if the reasons are primarily financial, so be it. I think it does generate plenty of revenue, and I think many people realize it also saves the law enforcement resources, and also it's valuable in that we're not putting otherwise productive people in the criminal justice system for no good reason.
Yeah, I have another question. This is Karen again. In states that have legalized marijuana, so obviously employers shouldn't be screened. Do they still screen for marijuana on a pre-employment application? And then what happens, for example, to someone from Alabama who goes to Colorado, for example, uses marijuana and then is drug screened in the workplace, even though they used it legally in a state?
Yeah.
Have you heard of any of these sorts of scenarios?
So yeah, there could be, so as you know, consider UAB, the medical center, which screens for nicotine use. Tobacco is legal, and it's commercialized, widely available, but the UAB Medical Center years ago, if you remember, decided not to hire people who tested positive for nicotine. So
I think they stopped that.
did they stop? I didn't know that. Well,
Still
employers can,
but it's purely for like how much they're going to charge you for health insurance.
Yeah, yes. So employers can do what they want. So you could be in the state of Colorado and say, well, cannabis is not illegal in the state, but the employer can say, but we would like to only hire those who are not using, and we will require that you not do so and have random drug screens, and there would be consequences if you use. They could do the same with alcohol or tobacco if they chose. I'm sure there'd be potential legal battles in that regard, but my understanding is that there are plenty of employers in Colorado that still choose not to employ those who test positive for THC. Now, I don't know what would happen. I mean, certainly in the state of Alabama, you could say, I haven't engaged in an illegal behavior if I was in Colorado. On the state level, it was federally not legal, but no one's going to, the FBI are not going to come to your door and arrest you for having gone to Colorado and used cannabis a month ago or 2 months ago. But an employer could choose very well not to hire you, and I guess that would be their right, pending lawyer's opinion on that matter. That's what makes it interesting too, when it's again legal at the state level but not at the federal level. But even if it were legal at the state and federal level, I suppose any employer could choose to, as UAB did at least one point in time, not employ those who test positive for any number of substances. I suppose we could decide not to hire people who use coffee because we feel that's problematic. I guess it's up to the employer.
There wouldn't be any employees left, but yeah.
No.
That's also how it works in like professional sports leagues, right? I mean, the Denver Broncos, the Chicago Bears and Cubs or whatever are localized in states that have permission or legalization of marijuana, but if they fail a drug test, they're going to get fined and suspended and go into programs to curb that.
Yeah, and I think that was a big issue, actually, going back to Ricky Williams, who we mentioned a while back, extremely talented athlete. And I think he had tested positive for cannabis and was clear with the league that he didn't think it was problematic, that it was helping him, and that he didn't intend on changing that behavior. And when he tested positive once more, he may have, taken a sort of hiatus from the NFL before returning and completing his career, I think, with the Dolphins. But, some athletes are pretty adamant in their continued use and feel that the policy is just wrong. It opens a lot of, I think it opens a lot of questions. If you have an employer or a sports league that has determined you can't use this drug and it's legal both at the state and federal level, then who are they to say that one can't do this, especially if there's no evidence that it's a performance enhancing drug in the case of sports. I'm sure that the lawyers will have their say ultimately.
I have a question going back to Roy and Son's slide about how marijuana utilization in products may change in the setting of legalization. And in particular in the setting of state legalization without federal decriminalization or rescheduling, how do we protect the lay public from marketization and product variation from an industry, by an industry that is, like Marlboro invested a ton in marijuana industry, like over 2 billion, I think. And, these are just companies that are known for not really caring about their customers' overall health. So how do we protect the public from that in the absence of federal changes?
Go for it, Rian. Unmute.
Yeah, I'll mute myself. I think that's a really good question, right? I think that gets back to like the core public health question of how much should you intervene with people's choices. Shall we just, like, ideally speaking, you would inform them of all the potential health consequences, and the individual should make their own decision. But then sometimes, there are debates like that level too, because if people get addicted and they can't, 100% be responsible for their decisions. So I do think there is potential danger in that area of, I do personally think that there will be an increased use if we legalize it. But I don't know, I don't know if electronic cigarettes would be a good example in this case that, like the FDA are actively making regulations right now based on what's going on. So maybe in a few years we'll have better regulations, but it will be like a process.
My own sort of ideal scenario might be that you have, and I'm sure someone might accuse me of being a socialist when I say this, but I don't identify as one, but would be to have a sort of government-controlled dispensary. So we don't have an industry that has a vested interest in promoting use and promoting heavy use. There'd be like a government monopoly on a dispensary where you could discreetly, obtain the plant if you wanted it. And this is if we have a medical model. And that there could be, within that model, appropriate, regulations that might minimize harm to the population, to the public. I think my biggest concern is if we really allow for a for-profit industry, there's going to be, on their part, a vested interest in encouraging use and a lot of it, because that's how they generate profit. I mean, obviously right now, like I said, it doesn't make any sense to treat it as criminal. I think we can all agree that's kind of silly and harmful to those who use. But I'm also concerned about creating a sort of for-profit industry where heavy use is encouraged. So I think we could probably start at a small number of government-owned dispensaries where you won't see commercials or any sort of marketing attempts to increase use, but allow the product to be obtained safely and inexpensively for people who could benefit from it, like those with cancer or HIV.
I'd like to make a point about that. This is Jamie. I know there's some research looking at out of Colorado, just, you know, checking personal IDs basically at the store, of a recreational store for marijuana. And the compliance rates for that are, you know, somewhat high, but it varies, right, between like stores in Colorado and stores in Washington State. I know David Buller and his colleagues out of Colorado, Golden, Colorado, have looked at this. And I think that's just generally, like, listening to the discussion right now is like, you know, thinking about if it gets legalized for recreational purposes, then there's also like these new set of regulations that are going to have to be enacted, i.e. for underage users. And so I think that's, you know, another interesting layer to consider. You know, if stores, recreational stores, are in charge of checking IDs, you know, at the door, and like you were just saying, Peter, if they have this vested interest to sell the product, you know, are they actually going to be checking the IDs? And so just thinking about, you know, the risks for like this developmental age of late adolescence, emerging adulthood, I think those are important considerations.
And that's a really good point. And Jamie, I remember reading only recently an article on college binge drinking and really what's problematic about it, what seems to be driving it. One thing they mentioned was that the vendors, the people selling the alcohol, seem to do a very cursory check on ID. You know, that they have a vested interest in selling kegs and alcohol to just about anybody, and they don't especially care if they're underage. And if they can present any kind of ID that could plausibly pass as indicating they're 21, they're happy to do it. And what the conclusion of the article was, clearly these, you know, we need to enforce the laws at the site of sale, the point of sale. And again, you know, big concern is always when you allow people to profit from the sale of a potentially habit-forming drug. That's why I'd like to see it not in a for-profit industry, but maybe for there to be a government monopoly.
Yeah, good point.
I think we're at the top of the hour, so why don't we go ahead and wrap up. I really appreciate everyone coming out today and listening to our CAPPI Chat. We'll be doing another CAPPI Chat in a month, so you can go to our webpage, UAB CAPPI, and under CAPPI Chat, find our next topic, which is going to be on addiction in the time of COVID, and that'll be in October. It'll be actually October 21st. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.